Have you ever wondered what happens when warriors who spent decades mastering the art of mountain ambushmen, who defeated the Soviet Union using patience, terrain knowledge, and darkness as their greatest weapon, discover that the darkness no longer belongs to them? What it takes to turn absolute confidence in your environment into the realization that you've been watched, tracked, and cataloged for hours before you even knew the enemy was there. Staff Sergeant Mike Corrigan, 27 years old, from Rapid City, South Dakota, felt the weight of his night vision goggles pressing against his temples as he scanned the ridgeline above. Third deployment to Afghanistan, 75th Ranger Regiment. He'd learned to trust his instincts in Kandahar and Helmand Province, and right now those instincts were screaming that something wasn't right. The valley was too quiet. No shepherds. No distant voices. Just wind moving through rocks that had witnessed centuries of ambushes, exactly like the one he suspected was being prepared. He thought about his daughter Emma's 4th birthday party. He'd missed 3 weeks ago, her voice on the satellite phone asking when Daddy was coming home. He'd told her soon. He'd promised her soon. If you're watching this, you recognize that military history isn't just about tactics and technology. It's about the men who executed those missions under impossible conditions. This channel exists to tell their stories with the accuracy and respect they deserve, without glorifying war or simplifying the choices they faced. Subscribe now and join those who refuse to let these experiences fade into footnotes.
October 2010. The Pech River Valley in Kunar Province had earned its reputation as one of the most dangerous pieces of terrain in Afghanistan. 75th Ranger Regiment operated here because conventional forces couldn't. The mountains were too steep, the Taliban too entrenched, the local population too sympathetic to insurgents who'd been their neighbors for generations. Mike Corrigan's 12-man squad had been inserted via helicopter 48 hours earlier with a specific mission: locate and observe a suspected Taliban leadership meeting in a village called Ganjgal. Intel suggested mid-level commanders planning winter offensive operations. The Rangers were there to watch, report, and, if the opportunity presented itself with acceptable risk, capture or eliminate high-value targets. What Mike and his squad didn't fully appreciate yet was that they were being hunted by men who'd perfected ambush tactics against an enemy far more numerous and better equipped than any American force. Commander Qari Ahmadullah, 46 years old, had fought the Soviets as a teenager in these exact mountains. He'd learned from Mujahideen commanders who'd bled Soviet mechanized divisions white using nothing but patience, knowledge of every goat path and cave system, and the certainty that darkness made them invisible. The Soviets had helicopters, artillery, air support, and the Mujahideen had destroyed them anyway by choosing when and where to fight. Ahmadullah had survived 3 decades of war by never underestimating his enemy's firepower, while always trusting that his knowledge of terrain and ability to move unseen gave him the decisive advantage. When his scouts reported American movement in the valley, he began positioning fighters exactly as he'd done against Soviet Spetsnaz 30 years earlier. The Americans would follow predictable routes. They would set up observation positions with good fields of fire. And when darkness fell completely, his men would move into position using paths invisible to outsiders, and the trap would close. They weren't wrong to believe this would work. It had worked for decades. Mike Corrigan carried a photograph in his left breast pocket, Emma holding a drawing she'd made of him in uniform, crayons depicting his Ranger tab as a bright yellow rectangle she'd carefully colored inside the lines. His wife Sarah had sent it in his last care package with a note that just said, "She misses her hero." He'd folded it carefully to protect it from sweat and dirt. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a guy from South Dakota who joined the army because his grandfather had been a ranger in Vietnam and because he'd wanted to do something that mattered. Third deployment. 7 months to go. Every patrol felt like rolling dice, and he knew the odds eventually caught up with everyone. He trusted his training. He trusted his men. But he also knew that the Taliban owned these mountains in ways Americans never would. The first indication came as tactile wrongness. Mike's hand on the rocky outcrop felt a vibration too rhythmic to be wind. Footsteps. Multiple. Moving with practiced silence, about 200 meters upslope. He froze, finger moving to his radio transmit button, then stopped. Radio chatter might give away their exact position. He turned his head slowly, scanning with night vision, and saw nothing. But the vibration continued. Someone was moving parallel to their position, and they were good enough that even ranger-trained senses barely detected them. The auditory crescendo built gradually, professionally. First, the distant scrape of fabric against rock. Then breathing, controlled, disciplined breathing of men who'd climbed these mountains their entire lives. Mike counted positions by sound alone. 4 men above, maybe 6 circling to their east flank, unknown numbers below cutting off their exfiltration route. His squad was dispersed across 300 meters of rocky slope, and the Taliban were moving to isolate each position. The sound pattern was unmistakable to anyone who'd studied insurgent tactics. This wasn't a hasty ambush. This was a deliberate encirclement by professionals who'd done this hundreds of times. Then, the visual revelation. Mike's night vision caught thermal signature bloom as a Taliban fighter rose from cover barely 70 meters away. Then, another. Then, 5 more materializing from terrain. Mike had glassed 3 times and declared clear. They'd been there the whole time, motionless, waiting. Some wore Soviet-era thermal blankets that masked their heat signatures. Others had simply used rocks and shadows with such skill that American technology couldn't distinguish them from landscape. Mike felt his stomach drop. His squad was surrounded by fighters who'd positioned themselves during daylight and waited hours without moving. That level of discipline and patience wasn't random insurgents. These were professionals. The olfactory environment shifted. Mike smelled tobacco smoke drifting down from the ridge. Casual, confident. The Taliban knew exactly where the Rangers were and weren't concerned about giving away positions because they believed the trap was already sprung. Mixed with the tobacco came the scent of chapli kebab. Someone had eaten dinner while waiting in ambush position. The smell triggered a visceral response in Mike's brain. These men weren't desperate or fanatical. They were comfortable, prepared, and certain of their advantage. The taste came as copper flooding his mouth, pure adrenaline fear as his brain calculated odds and came up empty. 12 Rangers. Estimated 30-plus Taliban fighters with high ground, prepared positions, and intimate terrain knowledge. Standard doctrine said, call for immediate extraction, but the nearest helicopter was 40 minutes out, and the Taliban could collapse the trap in 4. Mike's tongue pressed against his teeth, and he tasted blood from biting the inside of his cheek without realizing it. This was how Rangers died in Afghanistan. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of time. From his position, 7,600 miles away, in a climate-controlled operations center at Creech Air Force Base, Nevada, Captain Jason Webb watched the entire tableau unfold through the Reaper drone's infrared sensor package. He'd been tracking this Taliban movement for 90 minutes, watching thermal signatures converge on the Ranger positions with textbook precision. Webb was 32, former F-16 pilot who'd transitioned to unmanned systems, and he'd flown support missions over Afghanistan for 3 years. What he witnessed now was professionally executed entrapment. The Taliban commander knew his business. But what the Taliban commander didn't know was that every fighter he'd positioned was visible on Webb's screen as a bright thermal signature, catalogued, tracked, and already designated with targeting coordinates. The Taliban began their assault with disciplined fire from elevated positions. Short, controlled bursts designed to pin the Rangers while assault elements maneuvered. Mike heard rounds cracking past his head and impacting rocks with that specific whine thump of 7.62 Tuhaks 39mm, fired from AK pattern rifles. His squad returned fire, but they were shooting at muzzle flashes while taking incoming from 3 directions. Corporal Davis, 22 years old from Atlanta, took a round through his plate carrier that knocked him flat. The ceramic plate stopped penetration, but cracked 2 ribs. He gasped for air and kept shooting. Qari Ahmadullah directed his fighters with hand signals and whistles, moving his assault element forward in leapfrog bounds that Soviet Spetsnaz would have recognized and respected. He'd chosen his terrain perfectly. The Americans had nowhere to run. Their extraction point was covered, and his men had rehearsed this exact scenario against mock-ups of American defensive positions. He allowed himself brief satisfaction. The Americans were skilled, their return fire was accurate and disciplined, but skill meant nothing when you were surrounded and outnumbered 3-1. In 20 minutes, this would be over. Mike made the call that changed everything. Reaper 6-1, this is Ranger 2-4, requesting immediate close air support, danger close, all positions. His voice was steady despite the chaos, despite rounds impacting within meters of his position, despite knowing that calling strikes on his own coordinates meant trusting invisible pilots thousands of miles away to distinguish friend from enemy using sensors he'd never seen and technology he didn't fully understand. But he also knew staying pinned meant dying here. And at least this gave them a chance. Captain Webb's response came within seconds. Ranger 2-4, Reaper 6-1 has eyes on 34 enemy combatants, all positions marked, preparing to engage. Webb's fingers moved across his control panel with practiced precision. The Reaper carried 2 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles and 4 GBU-12 Paveway laser-guided bombs. He'd been watching this Taliban element for 90 minutes. He knew which fighters were leadership, which were assault element, which were blocking force. He designated targets with the methodical efficiency of a surgeon, prioritizing threats by proximity to Ranger positions and tactical importance. The first Hellfire impacted a cluster of Taliban fighters positioned to cut off the Rangers' escape route. The explosion lit up the valley. Massive overpressure wave, thermal bloom, secondary explosions from ammunition the fighters were carrying. Mike felt the shock wave even 200 meters away. Pressure change making his ears pop. 5 Taliban fighters ceased to exist in a microsecond. Ahmadullah felt his tactical certainty evaporate as the mountainside erupted. He'd planned for American artillery. You could hear artillery being fired. You had seconds to take cover. He'd planned for helicopter gunships. You could hear helicopters, see them silhouetted against stars. But this was silent death from invisible platforms that struck with precision he'd never witnessed. His blocking force vanished in flame. His assault element hesitated, discipline fracturing as men who'd never experienced drone strikes suddenly understood they were being watched by something they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't fight. Mike seized the moment. Advance by squads, move to Rally Point Echo. Go, go, go! Rangers erupted from defensive positions, moving with aggressive discipline, while Captain Webb adjusted fire to create a corridor. Second Hellfire took out the Taliban position on the high ground. Paveway bomb obliterated the eastern blocking force. The night became a strobing nightmare of explosions, thermal blooms, and the distinctive crack thump of precision munitions, eliminating threats with surgical accuracy. The Taliban fought back with everything they had. RPG rounds streaked across the darkness, machine gun fire raked Ranger positions, and individual fighters closed to grenade range with the kind of courage that demanded respect, even in the chaos. But courage without situational awareness is tragedy. Every time a Taliban fighter repositioned, Captain Webb's thermal sensors tracked the movement and designated a new target. The technological asymmetry was absolute and crushing. By late 2010, the United States had invested 9 years, hundreds of billions of dollars, and thousands of lives into Afghanistan, with objectives that shifted depending on who was speaking and when. The Reaper drone program represented the cutting edge of asymmetric warfare, the ability to strike targets with precision while keeping American pilots safe in Nevada. Taliban fighters like Qari Ahmadullah represented the opposite end of the tactical spectrum: personal courage, intimate terrain knowledge, and willingness to die for a cause they believed justified. Neither approach addressed the fundamental strategic question: what constituted victory in a war where tactical success didn't translate to political resolution? The decision that broke the Taliban ambush came not from doctrine or tactics, but from trust built between ground forces and remote operators who'd never met. Mike Corrigan was trusting his life to a voice on the radio, controlling weapons from another continent. Captain Webb was trusting his targeting decisions to protect Rangers whose faces he'd never seen. That trust, fragile and unprecedented, became the force multiplier that doctrine writers couldn't quantify. Webb called targets with clinical precision. Ranger 2-4, enemy squad moving to flank your position from north, 200 meters, designating now. Mike didn't question, didn't hesitate. He maneuvered his squad based on intelligence from sensors he couldn't see. Third Hellfire eliminated the flanking element before they closed within effective range. The Taliban assault collapsed not from casualties alone, but from the psychological impact of being hunted by an enemy that saw everything, heard everything, and struck from nowhere. The Rangers advanced through terrain the Taliban had controlled moments before, and the difference in capability became undeniable. Mike's squad moved with tactical proficiency earned through training, but amplified by real-time intelligence that removed uncertainty. Every corner, every boulder, every potential ambush position was cleared before Rangers arrived because Captain Webb identified threats 3 steps ahead. The phrase that would echo through after-action reports and training scenarios came naturally: "The darkness doesn't protect you anymore." The Taliban had owned the night for 30 years. That era ended tonight. Ahmadullah recognized defeat with the same professional clarity that had kept him alive for 3 decades. His assault had failed. His men were dying to weapons they couldn't engage. Continuing the fight meant annihilation. He ordered withdrawal with short whistle blasts, and surviving Taliban fighters melted into terrain they knew better than any American ever would. They carried their wounded and dead with them, a mark of professionalism that Rangers would later acknowledge in their reports. These weren't cowards. They were outmatched by technology, that fundamentally changed the tactical equation. The ambush that Qari Ahmadullah planned to destroy a Ranger squad instead became a demonstration of how technological overmatch can negate traditional tactical advantages. When dawn broke over the Pech River Valley, Ranger assessment teams counted 17 Taliban dead, including 3 confirmed mid-level commanders. American casualties: Corporal Davis with cracked ribs, Specialist Morrison with shrapnel wounds to his left arm, and Mike Corrigan with a split eardrum from overpressure. 0 fatalities. The tactical math was brutal and undeniable. Professional recognition flowed in both directions. Ranger after-action reports noted the Taliban's sophisticated approach, the patience to remain motionless for hours, the discipline to position forces during daylight and wait for darkness, the courage to close with a technologically superior enemy, even as precision strikes eliminated their positions. Captain Webb's debrief acknowledged the Taliban commander's tactical competence. Had this fight occurred in 2001 before widespread drone deployment, the Rangers would likely have been overrun. The Taliban weren't incompetent. They were professionals executing tactics that had worked for 30 years, only to discover that the fundamental nature of warfare had shifted beneath them. The immediate impact rippled through both American and Taliban command structures. JSOC planners studied the engagement as validation of integrated drone ground force operations. Taliban leadership analyzed it as confirmation that operating in concentrated groups during predictable night operations invited catastrophic casualties. The tactical lesson was absorbed by both sides, driving evolution in how each force planned and executed missions. Neither side's courage was in question. The asymmetry lay in sensors, communications, and precision strike capability that created an almost unfair advantage. The tactical decisions made that night echo through military history. If you have experience with similar situations, either the frustration of fighting an enemy with technological superiority, or the weight of coordinating complex operations across time zones and continents, the comment section is open. Numbers carry weight when you understand what they represent. 17 Taliban fighters dead included men with families in villages throughout Kunar province. Fathers, brothers, sons who believed they were defending their homeland against foreign occupation. Qari Ahmadullah survived, but lost fighters he'd trained personally. Men who'd followed him because they trusted his tactical judgment. That trust was shattered by an enemy they never saw, flying at altitudes they couldn't reach, killing with precision they couldn't counter. The psychological cost of that technological impotence would reshape Taliban tactics for the remainder of the war. American casualties were numerically light but psychologically complex. Corporal Davis would recover physically, but spend the next decade dealing with the memory of feeling a round impact his chest and believing he was dead for the 3 seconds before adrenaline confirmed the plate held. Mike Corrigan's split eardrum would heal, but the sound of precision munitions impacting danger close would echo in his nightmares for years. Captain Webb would finish his shift at Creech Air Force Base, drive home to his apartment in Las Vegas, and sit in his car for 40 minutes before going inside because the cognitive dissonance of killing 17 men and then returning to normal suburban life required processing time he didn't have. The battlefield aftermath was sensory in ways that tactical reports couldn't capture. Dawn light revealed scorched earth, where hellfire impacts had converted human beings into thermal shadows. The smell of burnt explosives mixed with something worse, the specific odor of violent death that anyone who's experienced combat never forgets. Mike walked the ground where Taliban fighters had positioned themselves, finding prayer beads, photographs of children, a Soviet-era medal for bravery that someone had carried for 30 years. These weren't monsters. They were men who fought for causes they believed in, using skills they'd perfected through decades of war. The thermal imagery that Captain Webb reviewed in his post-mission debrief showed bright signatures winking out as ordnance found targets. Clinical, precise, and emotionally devastating when you forced yourself to remember that each signature was a human being with hopes, fears, and family waiting for them to come home. The technology made killing efficient. It didn't make it easier. Mike Corrigan finished his deployment and returned to Rapid City in April 2011. He attended Emma's 5th birthday party, held his daughter, and told his wife he was done. 3 deployments was enough. He transitioned out of the Rangers, used his GI Bill to get a degree in education, and became a high school history teacher. For 15 years, he didn't talk about the Pech River Valley engagement except with other Rangers who'd been there. Then, in 2025, a student asked him to speak about his military service for a Veterans Day assembly. Mike agreed, but he didn't tell war stories. He talked about how courage exists on all sides of conflict, how tactical victory doesn't equal moral clarity, and how the men he fought against were professionals who deserved respect even in defeat. They served honorably. The Rangers executed their mission with skill and courage. The Taliban fought with bravery and tactical competence. Both sides demonstrated professionalism under impossible conditions. The fault, when there was fault, lay not with the men who fought, but with strategic policies that prolonged a 20-year war without clear objectives or achievable outcomes. The soldiers, American and Taliban alike, did their part. The question that haunts veterans like Mike isn't whether they fought well. They did. The question is whether the political leadership that sent them to fight did their part, or whether tactical competence on both sides was expended in pursuit of strategic incoherence. War creates heroes and tragedies on all sides. Qari Ahmadullah survived the Pech River engagement and continued fighting until 2014, when he was killed in a drone strike in Pakistan. He died believing he was defending his homeland. Captain Webb flew Reaper missions for 4 more years, accumulating confirmed eliminations that earned commendations and gave him PTSD he's still treating. Mike Corrigan teaches students that military history isn't about glorifying violence. It's about understanding that courage, sacrifice, and skill appear on all sides of conflict, and that honoring service means questioning the wisdom of those who decide when and where that service is required. If these stories matter to you, if you recognize that preserving these experiences with accuracy and respect is how we honor those who served, subscribe now and join those who refuse to forget. This isn't entertainment. This is memory, testimony, and the ongoing obligation to ask whether tactical excellence in service of strategic confusion is victory or tragedy.